Dear participants of our seminar, June seminar, I'm so happy to see you here, and it's my pleasure to invite our amazing guest. And please, I would like to introduce for you Raymond Tallis. Is a philosopher, poet, novelist, and cultural critic, and a retired physician and clinical neuroscientist. And uh, he was a visiting professor in the University of Liverpool and deputy director of the Master Administration and PhD program in philosophy at the University at Buckingham. And he has 4 honorary degrees for his contribution to the humanity. He was awarded university many awards. Yes, and let's start our discussion, our communication. The title of this presentation: Are you your brain? Let's start.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much. I do feel very honored to have been invited to speak to you. As I was explaining to Ina just earlier, we have a great affection for Ukraine. My son spent 2 years in Odessa, and he's written a book about Ukraine, and we are enormously grateful to you all what you're doing to make the world safe for the rest of us. So thank you. I feel very honored. And what I'm going to do is to try and answer this question. Are you your brain? Is this where the it of the physical world becomes the I, becomes the me? Now, as Ina explained, I have been a clinical neuroscientist for many years. I was until I retired. And I've had a lifelong conflict between me as a clinical and research neuroscientist who specialized in epilepsy, stroke, neurorehabilitation, who for that reason might tend to believe that the brain is the basis of the mind, that the brain is the me, is the I, and so on. But in addition, again, as in said, I have been a rather too prolific philosopher who doesn't believe that the brain is the basis of the mind. So you're going to listen to a quarrel between me and myself, and then you'll have to decide whether I or myself has won the quarrel. Because I've got two answers to the question. Yes, of course. Oh, no, of course not. So let's deal with the first answer. Yes, of course, you are your brain. What do we mean when we say that you are your brain? In what sense would we mean? Well, there's three possibilities. Do we just mean the brain is a necessary condition of consciousness, of being a self, of being an I? Or do we mean something a bit more than that? That the standalone brain, as it were, is a sufficient condition of consciousness, of being a self, of being an I? Or do we go further than that and think that brain, consciousness, and selfhood are actually identical, and what goes on in the brain is identical with what I am? Let me just focus a little bit on the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions, and I apologize uh, for those philosophers who are very, very familiar with this distinction. The necessary condition of something is a condition which is required for something to happen, required for something to be. A sufficient condition goes beyond that. It is not only required, but actually it's sufficient to ensure that something is the case. Now, here's an example. I'm living in Chester at the moment, and being in Chester is a necessary condition of being punched by someone in Chester. I'm very pleased to say that being in Chester is not a sufficient condition of being punched by someone in Chester. Otherwise, I would be being punched all the time. So I hope that makes the necessary versus sufficient condition difference clear. So what's the evidence anyway for thinking of the brain as a necessary condition of me, of consciousness, of selfhood? Well, as a neuroscientist and clinical neuroscientist, I was very aware of the global effects of brain damage or dysfunction, and that would include loss of consciousness. I ran epilepsy clinics, and many patients who had epilepsy, when they got abnormal brain function, or indeed lost some brain function, they lost consciousness and were temporarily had an interruption of their self. And there is a huge, huge literature on the focal effects of brain damage, damage to a particular bit of the brain that's associated with a loss of particular function. And sometimes it's very precise, loss of aspects of speech due to damage in a very specific part of the brain, loss of the ability to recognize people's faces, for example, which results from damage to the bit of the brain at the back, the occipital cortex. So it's perfectly obvious from that that the brain is a necessary condition of consciousness. And in fact, if you chop my head off, I wouldn't have much in the way of consciousness. I wouldn't actually be a self anymore. Um, these focal effects of brain damage range from aspects of awareness, from simple numbers to complex incapacities, the ability to recognize things. They include loss of aspects of memory, loss of aspects of agency. So somebody who's had a stroke with damage to the right hemisphere, they might not be able to move their arm or make complex motor functions. And damage to the frontal lobes of the brain may lead to loss of ethical constraints on agency. People become disinhibited and so on. So all of this points to the brain at the very least being a necessary condition of being me, of being the conscious being who is yourself, to be the sensing, perceiving, acting, thinking I. Okay, necessary condition, but is the brain a sufficient condition? Does the standalone brain create Raymond Tallis, create inner, and so on? Um, Many of my patients who had epilepsy, when they had discharges in the brain, they had quite complicated experiences associated with those discharges. They would have visual experiences, hallucinations, auditory hallucinations. They would have fake memories, all generated by discharges in the brain in so-called complex partial seizures. And when they took the tablets, they didn't have these anymore. And that suggests that what was going on in the brain was not merely a necessary condition for visual experience, etc., but also a sufficient condition. And this was developed very interesting by this remarkable man, one of my great heroes, I have to say. He's Wilder Penfield. He was a Canadian neurosurgeon, and he was very concerned with people who had uncontrolled epilepsy. And the reason they had uncontrolled epilepsy was may have had brain damage, and there was a scar in the brain that was triggering off the seizures. And he, as a neurosurgeon, developed ways of removing the scars to control the epilepsy. But he was very concerned when he removed bits of the brain that he didn't remove areas that were absolutely essential to normal function, like speech and so on. And you can do these operations in the waking patient because the brain doesn't feel things. And he would stimulate bits of the brain to see whether or not they were associated with absolutely crucial aspects of function. And what he found was that stimulating bits of the brain, patients could feel, have uh, hallucinations of vision and so on. And sometimes they would have quite complicated memories that of things that had happened in their past. And there was one particular woman, for example, who had remembered the circus coming to town when she was 6 years old and so on. So that seemed to suggest that neural activity in itself is sufficient to be associated with consciousness, and sometimes quite complex consciousness. Those studies were published way back when in 1963, but much more detailed studies have been done since then, confirming the fact that stimulation of bits of the brain may lead to full-blown experiences. However, can we conclude from that that what goes on in the brain is sufficient to generate consciousness? Well, the fact remains in the surgical studies, the patient was already conscious and awake. So we weren't really, as it were, creating the whole of consciousness. And when it was a question of experiences of memories being recalled, these were memories of events that had been experienced in the normal way first. So it doesn't take us all the way there to the notion of brain activity being being sufficient for consciousness, for me, for the I. Um, let's try and go a bit further. If the brain activity really were not merely a necessary, but also a sufficient condition of consciousness, of selfhood, would it follow that you are your brain? Is neural activity identical with consciousness, with the I, with the me, with the self? And that's where I come to the second answer to the question. I've already told you, yes, of course. Now I'm going to say, no, of course not. Why do I come to that seemingly counterintuitive conclusion? Well, we have to remind ourselves, when we're talking about the brain, we're talking about a piece of matter subject to the laws of physics. The brain is a material object. Now, here's a character some of you may be familiar with. It's Daniel Dennett. He was a brilliant philosopher. He and I disagreed over many things, he was great to disagree with because, A, I thought his ideas were wrong, great, and the other is he wrote absolutely beautifully. So here he is, Daniel Dennett, uh, and he felt that the brain and the mind were identical. And behind that was a large picture that he had, which is the thought that there's only one sort of stuff, matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. And the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain. So it seems possible that there is an identity between you and your brain. And he adds that we can, in principle, he doesn't say which principle he's talking about, we can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth. So, of course, there must be an identity between your mind and something that's going on in a bit of matter, and the bit of matter in question is the brain. Well, hang on a moment. If it was what's going on in the brain that explains consciousness, how can we account for the fact that most of what goes on in the brain is not associated with consciousness? The spinal cord that goes down the back, the cerebellum, which is at least as complicated as any other part of the brain, and most of the cerebral cortex aren't associated with consciousness, or with the sense of I, or with the sense of me. Worse still, there's no fundamental difference between activity in the brain that's associated with consciousness and activity of the brain that is not. Well, people say, well, what happens is neural activity, it goes up the spinal cord and goes into the brainstem and ends up in the cerebral cortex, and that's where it becomes conscious. Well, we have a saying in the UK that travel broadens the mind. But why should neural travel broaden into a mind? And there's no obvious answer to that at all. There's also the fact there are properties of mind that are not seen in the physical world. And the most universal or general property is what philosophers would call intentionality. This is the concept that was originally introduced by the Stoic philosophers. Then it was an important concept discussed by medieval philosophers. but it really came into uh, assume a central position in the philosophy of the phenomenologists such as Brentano and Husserl and so on. And they pointed out, as Brentano in particular did, is that mental phenomena have a property of intentionality. They are about something. They're about something that they are conscious of being different from themselves. Indeed, they intuit what they're about as an object separate from the experience. So, for example, when I see this book, I have an experience of looking at this book, sorry, holding it up, and that experience is about something other than me in a very complex way, as I've indicated. So all the different properties of consciousness, from the ground floor perception, then a little bit higher up to knowledge, beliefs, and thoughts, and then to very complex things such as plans, the plan to give a talk, as today, all of these things are elements of consciousness that have intentionality. They are about something other than themselves. I want to just begin at the ground floor, because if we have serious problems understanding the relationship between the brain and even ground floor consciousness, it must be absurd to look to brain science to cast light on the upper stories of consciousness, such as love and wisdom and appreciation of art. So let's start on the ground floor. And let's look at this person. She's looking at a glass. She's seeing a glass. So what's going on there? Well, something very peculiar. How does she see the glass? Well, the light is bouncing off the glass. It enters her eye. It tickles up the retina and stimulates the visual pathways and eventually ends up causing activity in the visual cortex, the occipital cortex. That's the incoming light resulting in neural activity. That's all pretty well straightforward. It's the kind of um, causal mechanism that you would see in the physical world. But of course, that's only the beginning of the story. Yes, there is incoming light tickling up the nervous system, but then something quite different happens. There is an outward gaze that is about the glass. It reaches, if you like, causally upstream to its own cause. And that is the profound mystery of intentionality, of the aboutness of mental phenomena, and all of those things that make up what it is like to be me, what it is like to be I. So the ordinary materialist physiology of visual perception explains the inward causal chain, the light going from the glass to the back of the brain, but not how this results in a gaze that looks out. And then we get much more complex intentionality when we're talking about knowledge, plans, etc., etc. So already you can see we're in real trouble when we're trying to explain how neural activity is about a world other than itself, about objects other than itself. The significance of intentionality is that it creates something that is absolutely central to our humanity, which is an ever-widening gap between the conscious individual like you and me and what we see as the material world around us. Of course, we're part of the natural world. I'm sitting on this chair and I'm pressing on the chair like any other material object. But I'm also separated from the material world by an aboutness. I'm aware that the chair is other than me. And this aboutness keeps me in touch with the material world, but also separate from it. And of course, with human beings, it all gets much, much more complicated because we not merely have the intentionality of our own consciousness, but as human beings, we share intentionality. And out of the sharing of intentionality, we weave the fabric of the human world, which is outside of nature. This is the essential precondition of our deliberate use of science, such as I'm using now when I'm speaking. to convey meant meanings that distance me from my surroundings, that unwire humans from nature. It's very interesting. I've been interested in pointing. I wrote a book on pointing because it is something unique to human beings. Even our nearest primate kin, like chimpanzees and gorillas, they don't point in the way we do. We have something called declarative pointing. And we all know the experience, don't we, of pushing a baby in a pram down the road and the baby's pointing everything out to you. The baby is sharing her world with you. And this pointing and other forms of communication, it's out of this that we human beings create the shared common world. And none of this makes sense in relation to material events going on in the brain. The products of joined intentionality, facing a shared world, joint agency, teamwork, working together, all the wonderful technology and artifacts that we populate our landscape with, institutions, arts and sciences, all of these are woven out of joined intentionality. And none of them can be explained by neural activity, by nerve impulses, by ions passing through semi-permeable membranes. We live, in fact, in a theatre for human life, woven out of shared or joined attention, sometimes often embedded in artifacts. We live in, as linguists would say, a semiosphere. So the self-brain identity, the idea that I am my brain, is actually now looks less likely, because in claiming that I am my brain, I'm trying to find the community of minds woven from 1 trillion cognitive handshakes in bits of the standalone brain lighting up in the intracranial darkness. That's not the end of the troubles for the notion that we are our brains, for the mind-brain identity theory, for the I-brain identity theory, because there are features of our consciousness which cannot be understood in terms of neural activity. There are dozens of features, but I want to focus on two that are particularly engaging. One is what's been called the binding problem. It's been researched for decades and no progress had been made. Unity in multiplicity. And the other is temporal depth, and I'll come to both of those in turn. Let me deal first with unity in multiplicity, the binding problem. As I'm talking to you now, I can hear my voice, I can see my hands moving, I can see your faces on the screen, I can see my slide, I'm aware to my right of things outside the window, I'm aware of the pressure on my feet as I'm sitting, putting my feet on the carpet and so on and so forth. I am co-conscious of many separate things, but they're gathered up into a conscious field. And it's not only bodily sensations, not only awareness of what is out there, but memories that I mobilize in order to be able to give this talk. Emotions, plans, and so on and so forth. And all of these belong to a moment of consciousness. Here's an example. I look at this stream and see the heron in the middle and the beautiful trees and so on. But I bring it together, but it doesn't collapse into one thing. There is integration of the contents of that view, but it doesn't, as it were, merge into a mess. Now, we're all, those of us who do neuroscience, are familiar as to how things are supposed to come together in the nervous system. It's called integration of activity. And if you take the little picture on the right, you can see there's lots and lots of neurons all gathering together and they're united and then they have a single output. This is called spatiotemporal summation. Now, if it really was a matter of all that neural activity then producing one neural output, we wouldn't have that beautiful picture of a heron by the stream with the lovely leaves, etc., etc. It would be a total mush. So we haven't any idea of how we have this
This
unity
unity.
of our conscious field, but also the fact that its contents remain separate. What about temporal depth? Um, at any given moment, I'm not confined to this moment. The past is present. That's why I can make sense of things, make sense of my slides, make sense of the thoughts, and so on and so forth. And also, I'm reaching towards the future. But that future is also present. I have a sense of a goal. In other words, my moment of time isn't just, as it were, a physical point. It is stretched out. It has temporal depth, something that both William James and Martin Heidegger spoke a lot about. This is tensed time. And also, we often are aware of tense time as the explicit pastness of things. Now, Plato thought that memories or experiences left little marks, as it were, on the wax of the brain, and that's how they were preserved. But actually, memories aren't stored like that. Because if I think about a past event, I not only remember the event, but I actually remember it as past, as belonging to a past world. And this is not possible to be explained physically because there is no tense time in the material world. And it's even more interesting if my wife and I are reminding ourselves of a holiday we had in Greece 2 years ago, and I'll say, gosh, do you remember when the waiter dropped the bottle of wine and everybody looked upset and somebody said, yes, and look at the expression on the waiter's face and so on and so forth. And we can unpack a whole pop-up store of memories, but we are aware that those memories are of things that are not happening now, but happened in a past, and in a shared past that belong to a shared world. None of this has any physical equivalent. Don't take my word for it. You'll recognize this man, Einstein. And he grieved at the fact that there was no way of making sense of tensed time in the most advanced physics, particularly in the general theory of relativity. And he actually believed that tense time was not unreal. And here's a little letter he wrote. These two people are Mr. and Mrs. Besso. Mr. Besso was his oldest friend from school, and Besso died prematurely. And Mrs. Besso was obviously grieving, and Einstein wrote her a letter, hopefully trying to reassure her. Now Besso, she says, has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing. People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Well, it may be an illusion, but it's real. And for us, having a sense of moving towards the future, having a sense of having been in the past, understanding the present in relation to the past and future, there's absolutely nothing like that in the material, physical world. So I'm sorry to say, I now draw a second answer to the question is whether you are your brain. No, of course not. I think it's probably reasonable to say your brain is a necessary condition of you. Remove my brain and my intelligence quotient falls, that's for sure. But it's not sufficient. And I don't think it's reasonable to say that you are identical with your brain. So how on earth has the belief that you're identical with your brain, and that if you want to understand the person, you should look ever more deeply into the brain, something I've called neuromania, how has it gained so many followers? Well, it's how we use language. If you want to brainify the person and say they're a brain, you just personify the brain. And that's what neurophysiologists do. They ascribe to brains, brain processors and neurons, capacities that strictly belong to persons. They talk about the brain carrying information, the brain coding, the brain delivering messages, etc., etc. Wittgenstein, of course, diagnosed this. You'll recognize this character, I think. He said, "We are bewitched by language. A picture held us captive, and we could not get out of it, for it lay in our language, and language seemed to repeat it to us inexorably." In other words, all the metaphysical work of trying to explain consciousness is done by the careless use of language. Wittgenstein's quite always very pleased when I quote him, as you can see in the slide here. One extreme example of personifying the brain is actually saying that everything happens in the brain that happens in the brain is information. And that sort of takes the strain off the brain, particularly if, as some philosophers say, everything that happens is information. And you may be familiar with this character, David Chalmers, who said, "Wherever there is causal interaction, there is information. One can find information states in a rock when it expands and contracts, or even in different aspects of an electron." So many philosophers use words like information so carelessly, it's not surprising that we personify the brain so that we can seem to be reducible, we persons, to brains. If you want the best contemporary account of how mind-brain explanations have run into a real mess, run into a cul-de-sac, then I would strongly recommend this wonderful article, review by Robert Lawrence Kuhn. It's a long article, but for those who are interested, it's worth reading. And by the way, anybody who wants a copy of the slides, I think I mentioned this to Ina, I'm very happy for them. Ina has a copy of the slides, or Andrea, I think. So, in conclusion, or is it an in conclusion, the relation between you and your brain is intimate, but utterly mysterious. That said, it doesn't seem as if the brain has the wherewithal to be the brewery of consciousness, the brewery of you. So I don't think you are your brain. And actually, at great length, I wrote about this in a book that came out last year called Circling Round Explicitness, which is the heart of the mystery of human being. And it has a lot on the brain as the brewery of consciousness. Well, I've just come to the end of my talk, and thank you for your attention, or the courtesy of simulating it. And, I would very much like some tough questions, please, to give me a tough time. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your amazing presentation. And
Thank you.
let's start our discussion. Please, questions, comments.
Shall I now? I'm
Yes.
just going to. Shall I open up the? Was that it? Oh no, I'm just wanting to see all the faces. Is that okay? Sorry, beg your pardon. Yes.
Uh-huh. Please, Anna Laktionova, please.
Hello, hello
Hello.
everybody. Thank you very much for your presentation. It really raises a lot of very complicated questions, and not to complicate it even more, I try to ask. I try to ask some clarifications. Why do you not distinguish between mind and consciousness, or do you distinguish? Because it was not obvious whether you do or not. And another one. So you were speaking a lot about intentionality and about aboutness.
Yes.
Do you take these notions as identical or tautological, and to what extent? Because from one point of view, intentionality could be treated as a capacity to be in the mental state of intention.
Yeah.
And if we ever are in such mental state as intention, then according to standard concept and theory of action and agency, we must act according to intention.
Yeah.
But intention is not within the action. Intention remains always to be external. So we are too much committing ourselves if we are recognizing ourselves as always being not just about something, but intentionally engaged into some contents.
Yeah.
So I guess that intentionality is a very tricky concept as such. And if we take joint intentionality, which you were mentioning, it becomes even worse. Why? Because we can speak about individual intentions. And if we speak about joint intention, then we can't avoid like sum up individual intention into a common one.
Yeah.
Which is quite different from the concept of agency, because when we speak about agency as also capacity to act, then we can distinguish between individual actions, collective actions as sum of individual, and common actions, which are not just collection, like playing an orchestra, when each individual action would be just senseless unless it is within a common action. But we cannot speak in this sense about common or joint intentionality. So my point would seem even quite radical, that we are much less experience ourselves in such a state as intention, and the concept of intentionality treated not just as synonymous to the concept of aboutness, which is much more fruitful, could be very misleading.
Right.
Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Um, Taking your first point, mind and consciousness. The trouble is, these are terms that are used in everyday life, aren't they? They're not technical terms. And as philosophers, we inherit the terms that are used in everyday life. I mean, mind, self-consciousness. These are three terms that are very fluffy and vague. And unfortunately, we have to deal with the language that we've inherited. Um, Certainly, everything that I said would apply equally to mind, to consciousness, and to self, and to the I. So, in other words, my concern about not being identical with the neural activity in our brain applies to Raymond Tallis, whether you think of him as a mind, whether you think of him as a conscious being, whether you think of him as a self or an I. The second point, another good one, is relates to the difference between intention and intentionality. And as you know, intentionality is very much a technical term used in philosophy, introduced by Brentano and then hugely developed by Husserl. And it seems to me that is quite different from intention. And intention is, as you again made the correct point, closely related to agency. So I'm just looking at intentionality as the property, the mark of the mental, as Brentano would say. And that seems to me to have a mystery that we can't explain in physical terms. Now, intention's very interesting. I wrote a book about it, as you may imagine, on freedom and its possibility of freedom and the nature of intentions. And it seems to me that we can understand what seems to be impossible in relation to our using the causally canal to bring about intentions that we have by formulating and envisaging possibilities. And an intention is really a state of mind which wishes to bring about, to realize something that doesn't exist at the moment, but is thought of as a possibility. So there, some response, but tell me if I've missed your point. And
Thank you very much. It's really the work in progress still to think about. But from what you said, it really looks like we are just doing by habit, just as we used to speak about aboutness and about intentionality as something tautological.
about, did you say tautological or? I mean, it's a central concept in phenomenology, isn't it? And I think it's generally accepted within philosophical discourse as it were, the mark of consciousness, the mark of the mental. And it's a way of capturing what is extraordinary, the fact that basically something's going in my head now, and somehow it reaches out to you, um, and or whether it's to this object or whatever. Actually, there's one bit of your question I didn't respond to, which is about joined intentionality. And I think this is something that is helps us to explore the distinction between um, quite complex non-human animals, like our nearest primate kin, and complex and human beings, and the way in which we weave together or consciously um, are aware of and aware of others' awareness of what is out there. I mean, it begins with typically with pointing, which is quite highly developed before language gets off the ground, really. And children who are sharing what they see have obviously a sense of your consciousness, my consciousness, etc., etc. And I think the sheer extraordinary complexity of declarative pointing seems to me to flag up one of the things that's different between us and our nearest primate kin. But that's a whole other talk. And
Thank you very much. That illustrates that we can speak about joint, shared, or common aboutness, but probably hardly about joint, shared, common intentionality, taking into consideration this
yeah.
special sense of intentionality. But thank you so much. Sorry for taking too much time.
Thank
Oh,
you.
no, no, no. All of our questions and discussion are welcome. Just now, Professor Dmitry Tsipeti, I would like to repeat that really my gratitude to Dmitro for the invitation of our speaker today.
Oh,
Please, your questions after that, Christoph, after that, Dmitro. Mhm.
Thank you very much, Raymond. It was pleasure to listen to your speech. Well, I will ask a question a bit later. I will comment a bit about preceding question. Well, first, it is clearly that in philosophy, intentionality is not the same as intention, but we can use really intentionality in a bit wider sense than just aboutness. If we take classical work of John Searle, intentionality, there is intentionality in two directions, from world to ourselves and from ourselves to world. So when it is from world to ourselves, it is our knowledge, it is our ideas, but there are also our desires and our intentions. So they include some ideas about desirable states. There is also intentionality connected with intention. This is mind to world intentionality. So there are two aspects of this, and it can be used a bit wider than just aboutness. But of course, aboutness is central for your points, and it is clear why you use it. So, well, my question is, usually in contemporary philosophy of mind, the problem of consciousness, of its reducibility or irreducibility to brain, mostly discussed in terms of qualia, or what is likeness, qualia, experiences, quality of experiences. You discussed it from other point of view, in other perspective, but how you can connect these two perspectives, intentionality and qualia?
could I just catch that last bit, just the final bit? Could you just repeat it? Thank you.
How you connect these two perspectives on consciousness. One is that you emphasize it, aboutness, intentionality, and another is qualia, experiences, qualities of experience, how you connect these two sides.
Yes. I mean, are you in a way flagging up perhaps the difference between transitive and intransitive mental contents? Is that the force of your question? Because clearly, when I'm looking at a glass in particularly distance receptors, it's perfectly obvious the object of my awareness is separate from my subjective experience. When it comes to something like an itch, um, some philosophers would claim that the itch doesn't have an intentional object. I think it does. I think if I have an itch in my foot, the intentional object is my itchy foot. And that's where and of course, I mean, while we're talking about intentionality, it is present, of course, at many other levels. Picking up on what has been said, my beliefs have intentional objects, maybe about my plans, maybe my intentions, but they themselves have intentional objects and so on. I've got an uneasy feeling, though. I didn't pick up the essence of your question. Oh, there you are, Dmitry.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Okay.
Yeah. Are you sure you're okay? You're satisfied with that? You're all right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, dear Christoph. Your questions or comments, please.
Okay, thank you very much. That was quite interesting.
Thank
One
you.
question you said, of course, this is not the same, and it cannot be because of intentionality and so on. But I think you would also recognize that all these things you are appealing to would not be there if there would not be a physiological basis of it. And even there must be, for the various things you are differentiating on a different level, there must be also differences on the physiological level. So it seems also completely depend on the physiological level basis which you have there. And then I don't find it so easy to say simply, okay, that does not work. Of course, we know that if you want to describe what is going on a computer with pictures which are demonstrated on or projected on the screen and so on, it would be difficult to explain all that in, let's say, in bits instead of higher concepts which we used. Yeah, of course. But that does not mean that all this can be reduced to some, in the end, to the electromagnetic level. And so that would be the question. So if there is any possibility to go around that, and I'm not so much convinced that this is such an easy talk that you then still cannot say, no, this is of course different. So the point would be you have various levels of explanation, and the higher levels, of course, are bound to the inferior levels, but it's all based on the physiological level. And then the question is, how can you say that that is still something different? So I do not want to be the advocate of this theory, but I'm really struggling with it. So the opposing theory. But I'm really struggling with how we can come to say there is something completely different. If you're not something like an epiphenomenologist and say, okay, here are appearing new things which aren't present in the material world, but even that, this epiphenomenological things would completely depend, even in the most smallest details from the physiological level. So I'm not sure whether I made it clear what my question is, but I think the complete dependence on the physiological level makes it much more difficult to say, of course, this is not identical.
I completely understand your point, and it's a really good point. And for example, if I looked at the inside of AlphaGo, the amazing computer system that was able to outplay everybody in the world on the world's most complicated game, if I looked at individual bits of the computer, I wouldn't see any game playing at all. And the game playing comes at a different level. But hang on, where does the game playing come? It actually only comes when at one end you have one person playing the game, and at the other end you have the computer. In other words, you require consciousness to generate these different levels. There have been attempts to say, you probably know the integrated information theory, which has taken a bit of a battering since it was criticized. But the notion was, well, you don't get any consciousness in individual neurons, but it's when you reach a certain level, then you actually start getting consciousness. You break a threshold. But you say a level of what? And they say, well, a level of information. Below consciousness, you have information in the brain. And I would say, no, you don't have information. Information requires a conscious subject receiving information. And and you may still say, well, the story's not over yet. Um, we may find different ways in which neurons can interact, which turn ions going through semi-permeable membranes into conscious experiences. But nobody has produced even the sort of outline of a model of how that might be the case. That's why Now, I gave the joke about neural activity traveling from one place to another doesn't explain how it becomes, as it were, consciousness. Travel broadens the mind, but doesn't necessarily broaden into mind. So we haven't got any kinds of models, and people are genuinely totally stuck. And who knows, we may get some kind of breakthrough if it can be approached from the empirical point of view. One final point, and somebody mentioned Searle. One of the things that Searle often does to explain weak emergentism and say it's okay, says, in the material world, we do have weak emergence. Take, for example, a drop of water. A drop of water is cold, it's shiny, and it's got viscosity. None of the molecules in that drop of water are cold, shiny, or viscosity. So clearly, it is possible to have new emergent properties within the material world.
Okay.
I say, hang on a moment. What you're describing as two levels, to use your word again, at which something is being examined. And it seems to me you don't have any intrinsic scales or levels in the material world. And until you have conscious subjects. In other words, to mobilize the notion of levels, you're already, as it were, depending implicitly, not explicitly, on the notion of a conscious observer. Is that unfair?
I I don't think so that this would work so easily. For instance, if you see, let's say, lower animals, yeah, and they seem to produce information in a certain sense that there is something, and we doubt strongly that they have enough consciousness, so they are able to react, and even in a very complicated way, to their natural stimulus which are around them and so on. And I don't think that we can use or have or need to explain what is going on within them by recurring to consciousness. And so there is something of working with information on a lower level, below consciousness, I think. And
Yes. Information is one of my favorite words. I even wrote a book about it called Myth Information. It seems to me that nothing becomes information except in when it encounters a conscious subject. For example, people would say that a cloud going over a pool in an uninhabited planet, you have information because there's a mirror image of the cloud in the pool. No, I would say it doesn't become information until somebody interprets it, a conscious being. But actually, just coming back, Christoph, if I may, I would advise, that reference I gave at the end of the talk, this looks at all the ways in which they try and make sense of consciousness in terms of neural activity. And the feeling is they're absolutely bankrupt at the moment, but you may not feel that's the conclusion to draw. Are you a neuroscientist yourself?
no, I'm not. I'm not. I'm a
No.
philosopher, and I'm not even a
Oh,
philosopher of mind. So, but I find your answer that we don't have any information before there is consciousness like a definitorical move, and I don't see the reason for that so far. And of course, what
yes.
you used as an example, that a cloud is reflected by the surface of a pond, of course, that is not information. You need something more. So therefore, I spoke of, let's say, more primitive animals which have no consciousness but seem to work on information or elaborating information, computing information nonetheless. And so therefore would not buy that example as a counterexample. Okay. Sorry.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please, Dmitro Lishenko.
Hello, thank you very much for your lovely and interesting talk. I have several questions in order to understand. Maybe I've missed something. Right now, actually, I have several questions, but before those questions, I would like to hear your maybe not definitions, but at least explications. What is information? What is consciousness? because maybe I missed your when you were defining them, because I've added a little bit lately. What is information? What is consciousness? How do you define them? How do
Certainly.
you?
I mean, consciousness, this is a word we've inherited, isn't it? But it is awareness. It includes sensory perception. It includes beliefs, knowledge, plans, emotions, and all that
Mental
sort of thing.
space, some mental space.
Mental states really nicely. Thank you. Yeah. As for information, I think, yes, of course, we can ascribe information to events taking place in the non-conscious universe. But really, what actually happens only becomes information when a conscious person receives it. For example, I've got supposing I had spots on the back of my hand, and I think I'm a doctor, I would say, gosh, that means measles. But those spots didn't mean to mean measles until a conscious subject who is sufficiently well informed saw them. In other words, it wouldn't become information. Likewise, all the things that were happening before conscious beings, they didn't become information until we had the backward glance of the scientists who are able to look into deep time and so on and so forth. Information requires
subject.
At least one thing. I mean, there's two aspects of information. One is the person or the state of affairs that generates the information, and the other is the individual who actually harvests the information. Now, you don't always have to have both. So when I look up in the sky and see there's clouds, that informs me it's going to rain. It didn't intend to inform me, but certainly it only becomes that it is going to rain in the eyes of a conscious subject who's capable of interpreting what the cloud means. Does that take you any nearer at all, or?
Yes, I understand, but it means that you do not take the definition, for example, which is used in natural sciences, or for example in information theory, like information is a distinction through which is made a distinction, or at least, for example, when information is identified with a specific entropic processes in the natural world. Entropy means implicit information which could be made explicit through subjects or through some specific measurements and so on. But actually, in natural sciences and in hard sciences, information is usually defined through a logarithmic process of such bits. For example, is there a distinction through information in the world? A distinction is being made. You can ask always by whom, but this is another question. Actually, this is a different level question.
It's a very good point, because I mean, I think our muddle over information began in the 1940s with the famous paper, and my mind's who can tell me, in which information was introduced as an engineering term. Claude Shannon.
Shannon's formulas, yes, logarithmic.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And at the very beginning, he said, look, don't confuse information in my engineering sense, which will determine how much you charge for phone calls and whatever, with information in the human sense. And he gave one very good example. He said, supposing this machine is generating letters randomly. Any given letter, let's say the letter G, appears, I get 5 bits of information because I've got 1 out of 26. But supposing there's a question, is my beloved live or dead? That's also 1 bit of information in the engineering set, as opposed to 5 bits of information from the alphabet. So he was very cautious. Shannon and Weaver very careful about separating information used usefully in assessing machines from information as something that matters to, makes sense to, we're aware of.
Okay. And my first question, second question, which today right now have become the second one. Okay, you have said that about necessity, that the brain is a necessary condition for consciousness. Yes, by conditional, it means that if there is consciousness, then there is a brain. And by the contraposition, we can say that if there is no consciousness, then there is no brain. Or if there is no brain, then there is no consciousness. I mean, contraposition of the implication relation. So it means, do you mean consciousness in general, or you just you are talking only about human consciousness? If there is no brain, human brain, then there is no human consciousness, and or I mean consciousness at all, or there is no other kinds of consciousness, only human consciousness. Can you specify this moment, please?
Certainly. I mean, basically, I think I was talking to myself, am I my brain? And the answer is, if you chop my head off, there's no I anymore. So it's a necessary condition. As to how far through the animal kingdom consciousness spreads, I don't know, because there isn't a totally safe diagnostic sign of consciousness. I mean, I'm pretty sure that chimpanzees are conscious. I believe probably that octopuses are conscious, and I'm pretty sure that viruses aren't conscious. But there's no clear diagnostic sign of consciousness versus no non-consciousness. So how far consciousness extends, to me, is a very difficult empirical question, which I don't think can be safely answered, really. But to come back to your question, of course, I was referring to the consciousness of this human being called Raymond Tallis or Dimitri or whatever. Yeah.
Okay, and so, for example, the problem of multiple realization is not multiple realization problem. I mean, functionalistic consciousness, machine consciousness. This is not your belief, yes, at all. I mean,
well, I mean, the reason I'm bald is I'm tearing my hair out in lumps. When people talk, that's how I became bald. But basically, it seems to me, in principle, there is no likelihood of having conscious machines. They may do all sorts of things that conscious people like you and me couldn't even begin to do, although they don't do them. I mean, again, we tend to ascribe to the machines we use the faculties we use them for. I mean, pocket calculators don't calculate. Telephones don't make phone calls. It's people who use pocket calculators. And so, of course, you can do incredibly complex things with computers, LLM, etc., etc. But I have absolutely no reason for thinking that they are conscious. But do you feel I'm a bit naive? I mean,
no, I just don't know. Actually, for example, for example, we can recall Chalmers. He is a bit functionalist, a bit property dualist, and he says that he usually says that I don't know, maybe some specific complexity of organization of some specific system would produce consciousness, and without any necessity to be it organic even. Or have a cerebral system, something like, or maybe we can again all those thought experiments, which we can, for example, substitute our neurons, neuron by neuron, and where, for example, silicon neurons, organic neurons by silicon neurons, and where does it begin to fade away our human consciousness and to emerge non-human consciousness? These are very tricky questions, actually. So I don't know.
Yes, I mean, that's a thought experiment that fails at the first step, because so then just to reiterate for everyone, essentially the notion is, so here you've got Raymond Tallis with his brain. And the question is, could you have a robot that had Raymond Tallis's conscious properties? Well, let's take one of Raymond Tallis's neurons away and replace it with a silicon chip. Then take another one, and then take another one. At no stage is there going to be a sudden change, but suddenly all of my neurons have been replaced by silicon chips. Why shouldn't I be conscious? And basically, it's about tensed time. Because when you, as it were, replicate the structure of my brain in silicon, you're trying to replicate something, if it is my brain that's responsible for my consciousness, that is actually in tensed time. And there's no tensed time in silicon chips.
Okay, again, the problem of definition. You have defined consciousness as a system of mental states through from the subjective point of view, actually, and we don't have that conscious meter in order to measure those conscious states. Whether do you have them, or whether a silicon chip or an individual neuron or a group of neurons have it, we don't know. Okay, but this is this, and my last question, maybe wait a second. Yes, not question, actually, it's not a question, it's a remark. When you were talking about time, you have cited Einstein, but Einstein was not talking about in irrealness of time. He was talking about the illusory of the time flow, the illusion of the time flow. From the point of view of physics, and especially from the point of view of general relativity theory, not general, special and general relativity theory of these two Einstein's theories, time could be considered, is considered as a physical thing, actually. It's a space-time. Actually, today, physicists refer to it as some kind of law of, how do they, yes, there is a theory in philosophy, growing block theory,
Yep.
Or so-called perdurantists, they define time as a space-time continuum, or it has its correlations in the special relativity theory of Einstein's special relativity theory, when we are dealing with law of bread metaphor for time explication. And actually, if it's actually very interesting. Mathematically speaking, we can say that time of the universe exists the whole time of the universe exists. It is already completed, actually. It's already completed, and there is past, but our consciousness, we as human beings, for example, or maybe other sentient beings, they take away, or maybe I don't know, differentiate past, present, and the future. But actually, physically speaking, it could be argued, and there are very convincing arguments, that the whole time and the whole space exist as one specific, already physical, very physical thing, very physical entity. And there are correlations in the philosophical theories on that matter. For example, like perdurantists, they're four-dimensionalists, and this growing block theory, a little bit related to this, and so on. But physically speaking, when you said that time has no physical evidence, actually, many physicists would disagree with that claim. Many, not all of them.
Yes, I have to declare interest. I published a 700-page book on the metaphysics of time. It's been a long preoccupation. It took me 10 years to write. But essentially, what Einstein said was he embraced the being called the Parmenidean by Karl Popper. Karl Popper described Einstein as the Parmenidean, which is exactly what you're describing. And he did feel that there was an unchanging totality underlying his image of the world through the lens of general relativity, not special relativity. And he didn't think time passed. The passage of time is one of those favorite blunders I love teasing people about. But what he was aware of was, how on earth do we import tensed time into this tenseless world? So really what you're saying is you're very much reinforcing the point that I made, is that the universe, or at least the universe according to the currently most authoritative count, is tenseless. It is not timeless, although time and space can swap around and so on and so forth. So there isn't a problem, I don't think, with my mobilizing Einstein the way I did. There's a very good dialogue between Carnap and Einstein on Einstein's grief over the fact he couldn't understand the importation of tensed time into a tenseless universe. Yeah, but it's one of my preoccupations. So
I got. I mean, I thought that you do differentiate tense, and time. Yes. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much.
We will follow and we will give a chance to ask questions
Thank you very
by
much.
other participants.
just a quick
Thank you.
one.
We will come back.
In a Dimitri, the book is called Of Time and Lamentation, and I deal a lot with Einstein time and so on. But sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes, yeah.
Maybe we will come back to you, Dmitro, but just now I would like to give a chance to ask question. Anna again. And please, Anna. Sound. Microphone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Coming back to your presentation, you were talking a lot about I, self, myself, selfhood, consciousness, brain, mind, binding problem. But you were not explicitly speaking about the philosophical problem of identity and personal identity. Why do you avoid this topic explicitly? Is it an outdated problem? I mean, to find criteria for personal identity.
Yeah. Thank you. It's one of my preoccupations, and I've written quite a lot about it. What makes Raymond Tallis today and Raymond Tallis 10 years ago the same individual? And it seems to me there's both internal connectedness and there's an external scaffolding. So, for example, why am I the same as the chap 10 years ago? Well, clearly, it's not just a trickle of Humean sensations. You know, David Hume got that completely wrong. It wasn't just a series of perceptions. And you can see it's not a series of perceptions in that very passage. I don't know, Anna, you know the passage I'm talking about, where he says, when I look into myself, I don't see any self. I just see a trickle of things. And then he uses the word I 4 or 5 times and makes you realize that there is more to David Hume than the trickle of perceptions. But there is our internal connectedness, there is our body of knowledge, there are standing presuppositions, there are commitments, roles, duties, and there's the external scaffolding, as I talk about in one of my books, that, as it were, maintains the self. One example is if I come to my house and open the door, my wife doesn't call for the police because she recognizes basically it's her husband, you know, so that we're always have our sense being reinforced. Or if I went to the hospital and did a ward round, I wouldn't be arrested for invading the hospital because I was, you know, the doctor. So you have all that many-layered external reinforcement added to the internal connectedness of individual and shared memories, of dispositions, of knowledge, and so on and so forth. That's how I hang together. And I don't require some mysterious spirit in that sense. But does that address your question? I mean,
Yes, thank you so much. Because you were speaking a bit about necessity and sufficiency, right?
yes.
And in treating personal identity in terms of criteria, all of them should be simultaneously necessary and sufficient, and it's quite difficult to find it. But if I may, I just would like to say that we still need to sustain transitivity of personal identity. And those cases which illustrate very nice how I preserve to be myself through my life, nevertheless that I change physically, even mentally, or even somehow dramatically mentally sometimes, also with some biological, if not physiological background staying, because I think that speaking about biological background rather than physicalistic or physiological background could save a bit less commitment into it, but nevertheless we are remaining ourselves, and this remaining witness transitivity and how to sustain it if we don't need any criteria anymore. We can take it as a performative, I take it as a performative feature. We are performing ourselves as identical to ourselves, nevertheless, that all of those physical and mental changes which we can go through during our life, if we remain with so-called normal mentality, but what is normal is also quite not very strictly limited, right? So then it is not a criterial approach anymore. We perform ourselves, and then we don't need any justification by any explicated in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions or whatever other ways of describing what supplies our persistence of being ourselves through the life.
And when you're thinking of defining it performatively, what sort of performances would you be thinking of? My role as a doctor, or as a husband, or a father, that sort of thing? Is that the sort of my hobbies, my talents, such as they are, or I mean,
I am here could refer to Wittgenstein and Austin and performativity, which you cannot avoid saying of something without doing it.
yeah.
So you cannot avoid of being identical to yourself when you are not identical to yourself. So you don't need any further, as I said, necessary or sufficient external or internal features or criteria to somehow justify it. It is a performative justification, like self-justification, like self-demonstration as being identical through your life, and it could involve different cases, it could involve different physical and psychological features, etc., etc.
I mean, if you think you were referring to how to do things with words, Austin's notion of speech as a performative, that seems a bit episodic because the examples you give is like when you say, I do, when you're agreeing to be married, and the very fact you're saying it is doing it. But that seems to be a bit episodic. I mean, my continuity does seem to depend on many layers of internal and external scaffolding, including, of course, the performative dimension of speech. I mean, that I'd completely agree with, but it just seems to be a bit more to it than that.
If I may comment?
Yes, please. Yes. Yeah.
You see, the example from Austin, which you are given, still remain to be performative, but it is not directly performative. It is not illocutive, but perlocutive. When we are using or demonstrating something, rather as we are used to.
Yeah.
We are all saying, hello, how are you? We don't really mean to know how exactly are you now. It's just some gestures, just some points we are used to. But they still have some performative, not direct, but indirect force of accomplishing of what is going on.
And I agree with that. Just like when I say good morning, it's not a description of the morning.
Yeah.
It's a greeting.
But nevertheless, it has some performativity in it. It's like a gesture, like a sign that we are now starting, or we just recognize each other on the street, or whatever else, common or maybe not common, but any interactions is taking place.
So that's an important little micro affirmative, and we're surrounded by those, don't we? You know, if I came to the hospital, did a ward round, I'd say hello to somebody in the car park, and then when I get to the ward, the nurses say hi, how are you? I must take, etc. There's lots of little supportive things of reminders of who I am and why I'm here and how it connects with other things, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dmitros Ipeti, do you have a questions as I noted before? No?
No. Well, I wanted to comment a bit about what Dmitry said about David Chalmers, etc. Well, with David Chalmers, there are some problems, perhaps, with his comments. One thing, when we talk about computers or computer-like minds, if we imagine that computer can have minds, then in David Chalmers' perspective, it can be only epiphenomenalistic. And this is, I think, a very great price to pay if we take epiphenomenalism. It's one thing. On the other hand, those experiments that you mentioned, sort of experiments about neurons, about their replacement, then there is question how we think about mind. Certainly, Chalmers thought about mind as something emergent, as something strongly emergent, and then we just don't know what will happen when our neurons are replaced one by one by some artificial neurons. Perhaps that emergent mind will remain there. Perhaps it won't. So there are problems with this thinking. We don't know what the results of this sort of experiment should be, really.
Absolutely, yeah. And I love the word emergence because it really feels like an explanation, but isn't an explanation, isn't it? And I call it just turned upism. I mean, Chalmers is a strong emergentist, isn't he? He feels that there emerge phenomena that have causal properties that weren't present in that from which they're supposed to emerge. And I would say, yeah, that just simply describes the problem that I'm scratching my head over rather than any kind of explanation. Yeah. Yeah. I always think Chalmers has done very well from rather few solutions.
Thank you. And can I ask you come back to your Ray Tallis identity and to your intellectual biography? You started as a neuroscientist, clinical neuroscientist, and when and how, if I reconstruct your intellectual trajectory well, when you came to philosophy, or maybe just on the contrary, how this synthesis or some dramatic coincidence of philosophical and neuroscientific and clinical aspects of study of consciousness and brain came to some kind of entity in your personal intellectual trajectory?
I think it's always been two parallel stories. I don't think there's a point of convergence, if any there was. So, as a clinician, I would, particularly interested in epilepsy and stroke and so on, I would acknowledge the central role of the brain and appropriate brain activity in making sure one doesn't have seizures and so on and so forth. But I guess my problem with this has gone all the way back to my poor tutor at Oxford when I was a student, Oxford University when I was a student. The poor chap, I used to endlessly argue with him as to whether neural activity in the occipital cortex could really be consciousness. He was very patient. So I've always had this puzzle. Having said that, I mean, the first books that I published, non-medical books, were about post-Saussurean literary theory because I got very angry with the postmodernists and the theorists. Thought they were bad philosophers and worse linguists. But so it was only in 1990 that I then published a book relating to brain and mind and so on. But it had been a long-standing publication. Preoccupation, I beg your pardon. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. And it's disappointing one can't bring those things together. Sunday
Yeah.
evening, I would be doubting mind-brain identity. Monday morning doing a clinic, I wouldn't be doubting it at all.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Maybe I keep in the mind case of Oliver Sacks, as a neuroscientist, clinicist, and at the same time um, founder of some kind of storytelling, and his book about music philia. What do you feel some common feature of your some creation of such kind of entity?
Well, actually, I mean, he was a very interesting writer, and of course, he's made his name with the first book was the treatment of Parkinson's disease with L-DOPA. Um, but he seemed to have, to a lot of us, a suspiciously rather large number of very unusual cases. And so, but having said that, he's a good storyteller. And he was good at describing things. I mean, yeah, but his first book was the best, on Parkinson's disease. Yeah, but you liked another one, did you? The one on was it? Gosh, there was the man who mistook his wife for
Yeah.
a hat. Yes, yes.
Firstly, it was translated in Odessa. This book was translated some many years ago into
Yeah.
Russian in Odessa by psychologist, poet, and clinicist Boris Khersonsky, our Ukrainian.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Oh gosh.
Mm.
Wow.
Thank you, thank you. And what about music? My special interest here. When I visited New York and at the time of my Fulbright program, came to some bookstores, university, and found these shelves on the topic music, only music and brain as a priority of the discussion of this.
Mm.
What is your relationship with such kind of
You can probably guess.
reality, spiritual reality,
Yes.
music?
Yes. Well, I mean, I have a term what's called neuromania, which is quite different from neuroscience. So neuromania basically tries to explain things like the appreciation of art, belief in God, etc., moral values by looking at the activity of particular parts of the brain. I mean, to me, I don't think neuroscience has got much to tell us about our experience or appreciation of music. Um, the interesting thing about music is it is I've written a book which is called The Difficulty of Arrival. And one of the troubles is throughout our life, we're always dynamic, we're always moving on, we're always journeying, and we never arrive. Even when you're on holiday, you never arrive. Now, the great thing about music is that the journeying and the arrival are at the same time. So when you're at the beginning of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, you aren't thinking, oh gosh, wonder where we're going to get to and how long is it going to be, etc., etc. Already, each note is a moment of arrival. That emptying of the present tense by the future is actually reversed in music. I don't think there's any neuroscience for that, but it just seems to me that's one of the most wonderful things about music. I am besotted by music. I can't play a note, I can't read a note, and thank God I don't sing a note. But oh, I love music. Do you play, or as well as knowing about it, do you play music, or
Mhm.
no?
Thank you. And maybe my last questions, we will continue to, we'll come back to Anna, but before that, I would like to continue your question. Generally, how do you think these resources of phenomenology in general? Anna discussed with you problem of intentionality, but what about general understanding? What is the role of phenomenology, phenomenological thought tradition, Brentano, Gusserl, Merleau-Ponty, and other scholars
Well,
who
yes. I mean,
Dan Zahavi, who are very popular today, many other. What is the resource of? Because it's a question, and maybe some conflict, artificial maybe, between analytical and continental, phenomenological, and general. What is your
well, there's a very famous passage
understanding?
in Wittgenstein when he's talking about philosophy. He said, well, shall I study the headache I have now? In other words, shall I have a phenomenological approach, or shall I, in fact, analyze the concepts and so on and so forth? And it seems to me, for most of the 20th century, there was the division of those who, as it were, in the Husserlian, Heideggerian, etc., tradition, focused on consciousness and its contents, hence phenomenology and so on. And then there was on the other side of the channel and the other side of the Atlantic, there was the focus on concepts, words, the meaning of words, and so on. And I think we should get over this parting of the ways because consciousness is structured by concepts, and there are no concepts that live in us except as conscious tokens. So we must find a way that overcomes this gap between the phenomenological approach and the logico-linguistic analytic approach. I think some philosophers are sort of starting to do that. But I felt the hostility between those two approaches, particularly when Carnap mocked Heidegger, it seems to me has held back philosophy quite a lot. So I think there's a lot to be said phenomenologically, a lot to be said linguistic analysis, etc. But better still, let's see if we can find something to be said that goes beyond that parting of the ways. I mean, what about yourself? What do you feel?
Thank you.
No.
Thank you. Anna, please, your question.
Thank you so much. Excuse me that I'm exaggerating
Oh,
the
it's
opportunity to ask
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
questions, but as I see no other, so I allow myself to go to and
Thank
ask still into another direction. So, what is your opinion about neuromodeling? And neuromodeling with regard to neuromorphic computing and artificial intelligence, versions of artificial intelligence based on such neuromodels. Is it quite, you were mentioning, so it looks like you are quite skeptical.
I just missed the question a little bit. Sorry, but could you just rephrase it? Thank you. And
what is your opinion about developing of artificial intelligence upon
yes,
neuromodels, neuromodeling, and neuromorphic computing, I would say?
yes, yeah. So, in other words, if we replace silicon with neurons or transplanted neurons, it seems to me that we're unlikely to deliver consciousness through some kind of physical replica of the brain. Given that we have no idea how the brain delivers consciousness, it's difficult to imagine how physical replicas would be able to deliver consciousness. Um, so, in particular, I have the huge problem with tensor time, which is absolutely central to us being ourselves and so on and so forth. So I'm very skeptical. I mean, it's a dangerous thing to be skeptical, isn't it? Because I can imagine 100 years ago, I go to this meeting and somebody says, "Do you know what? Those clever scientists are going to create a machine where you can talk to somebody in Australia without raising your voice." And I will just burst out laughing and say, "What a load of rubbish." Of course, it's, mobile phone. So one's got to be a bit cautious about being dubious about the future. But I think there are good reasons for thinking, perhaps, that we will not be able to replicate the structure of the brain or whatever, and through that generate a conscious computer. But Anna, do you have a different view? Do you feel, what do you think?
Thank you so much for letting me. Maybe somehow it is really work in progress, but I do work on philosophical project on treating agency in terms of technology and trying to philosophically deliberate on of taking aligned human and non-human actions and other features connected with it. What seems very important for me is to be very aware and very clear that we can speak about human agents and we can speak about human-like agents.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
being human-like and being lifelike doesn't mean to be a human or to be alive.
Exactly.
And as far as we are very clear about it, and as far as our non-human agents with whom we are interacting are programmed in such a way that this distinction is moderately maintained. Nevertheless, that sometimes it's from human agents which comes this very readiness to recognize personhood or something like that within machines. We could somehow sustain, but it is enormously critical, very radical critic on this non-human interactions and a lot of dangers and deception. But if we go back from the very beginning, it was about imitation, then about stimulation. Now we are speaking about deception, and somehow opposite to deception appears to be trustworthiness. But why speaking about trust at all? Trust is an internal attitude. We can rely on machine in a very respectful way. Why not? But it doesn't mean that we should somehow forget that life cannot be faked. But when we speak about life-like, it's from beginning not a fake, but something like it. So probably we are facing the need of new concepts, that we are lacking some concepts which would help us to philosophically reflect and recognize what is going on and what will be going on in recent future.
Absolutely. And it seems to me that the focus on worrying about conscious computers is distracting from the real worry, which is something you were sort of hinting at, which is when the fake agency of machines gets out of control. And that is a real worry. Sort of not because they have any intentions or purposes, but because they're just out of control. And yes, one of the things that amazed me in two things in recent years. One is LLM models, where now they are able to do coding and produce better and better LLM models. And the other is the mechanical capability of robots, seeing them walking around in over difficult terrain. I mean, those two things amaze me, I must say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. After 1.5 hours, I would like to ask you any questions, comments, and maybe Dmitry Lishenko, I stopped your speech, maybe.
No, thank you. I'm fine. Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, but your communication will be in progress. I suppose it will be possible, and maybe it will be very important for us.
I must say, the collection of books that Dmitry has got behind his head is just amazing. I've never seen so many books.
I understand, Dmitry. Yeah, but I suppose it's only one small part of his great
Really
library.
Yeah. Actually, I live in the library. That's why it's not a it's not so.
Thank you very much for dear Ray. It was amazing dialogue, one of the most fruitful in the history of our seminar, because many participants can talk about their point of view and have a great debate with you, and maybe without some correlation agree. Many of our speakers today was not so agree with your point of view, but it's a very good condition for it we have in the discussion about this complex and interesting point. Thank you for all.
Oh, well, thank you. I've really enjoyed this. And if you ever wanted me back, I will rush back. So there, thank you. And even talking about selves.
I forget, we discuss, excuse me, I forget that about our future plan. Is it possible to talk about future now? We discussed it with Dmitry Sipeti and Ray, some series of our meeting with Ray. Yeah, I suppose it's only first step. We will discuss it when and how, you will come to us again, stay with
I'd love
us.
to. I'd
Please,
love to.
you are welcome with your texts. First of all, for example, small for the doxa and maybe more larger for the philosophical thought, our major journal. I suppose it will be only beginning of our close and fruitful
Thank you.
communication.
I would love it. Thank you. And thank you all. Yes. And
Any comments or some?
I've had a lovely time, I must say. So thank you. Dobro.
After some times, thank you very much, Andrei Kulik. We can follow for records of this seminar to repeat something, to
Lovely.
come again and continue to think about this.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's been lovely. Great.
Have a nice evening. Have a
And
nice
you too as
sleep.
well. And thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye, dear Christoph.